Mic check. Mic check. Mic check. Mic check. Mic check for the court reporter. Mic check. 1 2 1 2.
Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Test, test, test. Testing the court reporters. Test, test. 1, 2, 3.
Good morning. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our witnesses testifying before us today. Before I begin, I'd like to welcome the members of the committee present today who may yet arrive who are not members of the subcommittee. I ask unanimous consent that these committee members be permitted to participate in this hearing with understanding that all subcommittee members will be recognized for questions prior to those not assigned to the subcommittee. Without objection, so ordered. This hearing will help the subcommittee to assess force management levels, or FMLs, which are more commonly known as troop caps. The White House set a troop cap for Iraq and Afghanistan. That cap is 5,262 for Iraq. In Afghanistan, the cap is 8,448 beginning this January. Now, these are very, very precise numbers. Some might argue that setting a troop cap upends an orderly military planning process. Typically, military leaders are first given a mission, and then they determine what resources are required to meet that mission. Setting a cap first, however, constrains subsequent military choices. An imposed force management level leads to potentially dangerous trade-offs. Indeed, one consequence of a troop cap may be our military readiness. I look forward to learning about the extent to which readiness factors are or should be taken into consideration when a troop cap is implemented. In July, during a Readiness Subcommittee hearing, the Deputy Commanding General of the U.S. Army's Training and Doctrine Command expressed concern that because of troop caps, Army aviation brigades were deploying to Afghanistan without maintenance personnel. He said, and I quote, "Combat aviation brigades are not meeting readiness rates." He noted that soldiers were losing their edge and maintenance skills. This was, he warned, degrading, quote, "the ability of an aviation unit to regain readiness." I'm eager also to know how troop caps affect the deployments of Army brigades, which are charged with the train, advise, and assist mission. As I understand it, although it might be preferable for the Army to deploy entire brigade combat teams for this work, this is not possible because doing so would breach the troop caps. Therefore, as an alternative, individual senior soldiers are chosen from a variety of units to undertake the TAA mission. I want to gain a better understanding of how this practice might harm Army readiness, unit cohesion, career development, and retention. Furthermore, I'm concerned about how troop caps might influence the positioning of force protection personnel. For example, are medevac teams being placed outside the theater in Iraq because doing so allows them to not be subject to troop caps? If so, can they still respond quickly to recover injured warfighters? I would also like our witnesses to discuss other considerations associated with setting troop caps. How does the development of a troop cap fit into the planning process? But before I introduce the witnesses, I turn to my colleague, Mr. Cooper, who is serving as our acting ranking member until Representative Speer arrives, for your comments. Mr. Cooper?
I thank the chairwoman. I welcome the witnesses. I look forward to your testimony. I share the chair's concern about the arbitrariness of any troop cap. It seems to be the opposite of a threat-based analysis. I also share your concern about fudging on the cap, manipulating things so that you don't bring your Army aviation maintenance crews with you or keep your medevac folks outside of the region. Furthermore, I share the concern that when we fund contractors to do the same job, we're paying twice essentially for the same work and also undermining our readiness and active duty forces. But of course, we need to be forward-looking. It's up to the new administration now to solve these problems, and I think the public back home wants some reassurance that we're not going to mindlessly escalate in a region. But also we want to, when we have forces, use them in a proper fashion. So I thank the chair for having this hearing, and I look forward to the testimony of the witnesses.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Cooper. So I'm pleased to recognize our witnesses today, and I want to thank them for taking time to be with us. Members have been provided with a full biography of each witness, but joining us today is Mr. Kerry Russell, the Director of Military Operations and Warfighter Support for the Government Accountability Office. Mr. Russell will summarize some of the important work the GAO has done on this subject. We have retired Army General Carter Ham. General Ham retired from the United States Army in 2013 as the commander of U.S. Africa Command. He spent nearly 4 decades in the Army and is one of a very small number of military leaders who rose from the rank of private to 4-star general. And we have retired Army Lieutenant General Jim Dubik. General Dubik retired from the U.S. Army in 2008 after 37 years of active service. General Dubik's last job on active duty was as the commanding general of the Multinational Security Transition Command Iraq and the NATO training mission in Iraq. So thank you all for being with us here today. We'll now hear your opening remarks. Mr. Russell, we'll begin with you.
Thank you, Chairman Hartzler, Representative Cooper, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for having me here today to discuss some of the actions the Department of Defense has taken to maximize military capabilities while operating under force management levels. My statement today draws upon a body of work GAO has conducted over the past several years, examining aspects of military operations in contingency environments. Let me start out with some overall context about force management levels and their use in past and present operations. Basically, force management levels, also referred to as force caps, limit the number of U.S. military personnel deployed to a given region and have been a factor in military operations for a very long time, going back at least to the Vietnam War, where troop ceilings were set to manage the number of deployed U.S. forces. Force management levels are often set by the executive branch, but can also be influenced by external factors such as host nation limitations and coalition presence. More recently, force management levels have been used to shape the drawdown of forces in Afghanistan and Iraq, and now in Afghanistan as well as in Iraq and Syria in support of the fight against ISIS, U.S. forces are deployed under force management levels set by the current administration. Those levels are presently 9,800, which are going down, as Chairman Hartzler noted, in Afghanistan, and around 5,300 in Iraq and Syria under Operation Inherent Resolve. While force management levels have long been used as policy tools to shape and direct the deployment of U.S. military forces, they present a unique challenge to military planners, creating a planning paradox of sorts. As military doctrine states, planning begins with the end state in mind, providing a unifying purpose around which actions and resources are focused. Basically, the focus is on defining the military mission first, and then developing plans with the necessary resources to accomplish that mission. Thus, force management levels may have the effect of essentially reversing that order and establishing resource limits that DoD planners and commanders must then work within. With these challenges in mind, I want to highlight 4 key takeaways we have observed from current operations where DoD has leveraged existing capabilities to help work around limited boots on the ground. These include increased reliances on partner nation security forces, U.S. and coalition air power, U.S. special operations forces, and contractor and temporary duty personnel. With regard to partner nation security forces, DoD has increased engagement with partner nations through advise and assist missions that rely on partner nation security forces to do the planning, execution, and sustain operations. That is, working by, with, and through our partners more so than ever before. This can create complications, however, for U.S. planners in terms of providing the necessary supporting capabilities and resources where and when they are most needed. Further, as we have reported in the past, splitting up U.S. brigade combat teams to provide advisors creates challenges for maintaining readiness and training those brigades. Regarding air power, DoD has relied on significant U.S. and coalition air power to provide support to partner nation ground forces in lieu of U.S. ground combat capabilities. Since U.S. operations related to ISIS began in August of 2014, coalition members have flown nearly 44,000 sorties, releasing more than 57,000 munitions. Air-based intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance systems have also proved critical to commanders by providing them timely and accurate information, particularly in the absence of a large U.S. ground presence. However, this reliance on air power is not without its costs or challenges. For example, the Secretary of Defense has recently stated previously that the intensity of the U.S. air campaign against ISIS has been depleting U.S. stocks of GPS and laser-guided munitions. Regarding the use of special operations, DoD has increased its use of U.S. Special Operations forces to increase its operational reach and maximize capabilities under force management levels. However, the increased use of special forces in these current operations has resulted in a high pace of deployments, which can affect readiness, retention, and morale. Finally, DoD has increased its reliance on contractors and temporary duty assignments to round out its force constrained by force management levels. During operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, contractors have played a critical role in supporting U.S. troops and in past operations, sometimes even exceeding the numbers of deployed military personnel. However, the increased use of contractors and temporary personnel to provide support during operations has its complications. For example, DoD has had long-standing challenges overseeing contractors in deployed environments, even when there was a much larger and robust troop presence on the ground to perform that oversight. This completes my statement, and I would be pleased to respond to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Russell. General Ham?
Thanks, Madam Chairwoman. I think the members of the committee have my written statement. If it's okay, well, we'll just let that stand and be ready to progress to questions and answers.
All right, thank you very much. General Dubik? You're all about efficiency. We appreciate that's great. All right, well, we will go to some questions, and I will ask General Ham the first question. So in July, Lieutenant General Kevin Mangum, the Deputy Commanding General of the U.S. Army's Training and Doctrine Command, testified before HASC that deploying combat aviation brigades without their maintainers was causing an, quote, atrophy of critical skills. When aircraft maintainers are left behind the United States during their combat aviation brigades deployment, what tasks relating to their primary military occupation do they accomplish at home station to remain skilled since they do not have equipment to work on?
Madam Chairwoman and Mr. Cooper, thanks again for the opportunity to appear before you. I think that's precisely the right question, in addition to the others that you raised and Mr. Cooper raised in your opening statements. So when a unit is split apart, a unit that is not designed to be severable into various deployable components, there is, I think, a very real readiness concern. So in the specific case of Army aviation units, when most or all of the airframes, most or all of the air crews are deployed, and most or all of the maintenance capability of that unit remains at home station, there's a very real concern about how do the remaining maintenance personnel retain their proficiency. It requires an extraordinary level of effort on the part of the home station chain of command to find opportunities for them. Sometimes that could be at increased cost, sending personnel on temporary duty to other installations where the airframes upon which those personnel need to work on to sustain their proficiencies. There could be some increased cost. But for the most part, I think those skills would atrophy. They also lose the cohesiveness of an aviation unit. It is designed for the air crews and the maintenance, the ground support elements to operate together. When you separate them, post-deployment, it takes a much longer period of time to rebuild the readiness for which that unit was intended. So there are several consequences that affect readiness, and the point that Mr. Cooper raised of essentially paying twice for the same capability. We have those uniformed maintainers. We've paid for them. We've trained them. We've developed them. We've bought their equipment. But yet we then pay again to provide a contract maintenance capability in theater.
We have tried to get the dollar numbers from the Department of Defense on how much it is costing to backfill with contractors in Afghanistan. Haven't gotten those yet. Mr. Russell, has the GAO done any study? Do you have an idea of how much money we're expending for contractors to maintain the aircraft in Afghanistan while we leave the maintainers at home here?
No, at this point, we haven't looked specifically at those costs. They may be difficult to get. I know in general, trying to pull together contract costs can be a challenge within the department, but we haven't looked at that specific number.
Okay. General Dubey.
Yeah, Madam Chairwoman, I made some calls to some friends of mine who are aviators, asked the same question and anticipated this. The report to me was about 400 to 500 civilian contract maintenance personnel to work on a brigade's worth of aircraft at about $100 million a year. Now, I would certainly not take those numbers as gospel, because I think, as Mr. Russell pointed out, you really need to bear down on them. But it's a good ballpark figure. And this is for a capability that already exists in the force. So in addition to paying the cost of a soldier to maintain, you're paying the additional cost, as General Hams suggested, of sending some of those soldiers to other places, so there's temporary duty costs. You're paying the cost of an additional deployment, which is in fact what it is on temporary duty, and then the cost of the maintenance. So this is a complex and very costly approach to conducting what could be a military task, should be.
Absolutely, we're paying multiple ways through this scenario, and very, very concerning. Mr. Cooper?
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's relatively easy to beat up on troop caps or FMLs as a flawed device. And since I suggested in my opening statement, we need to be more forward-looking anyway. Why don't we try to use this panel to focus on what might work in Iraq or Afghanistan? Because I think most people would agree a light footprint is better than a heavy footprint, but that's if a light footprint works. And no one really has talked so far about the way special forces are treated. You know, sometimes unacknowledged, sometimes not counted, sometimes counted. Rather than focus on the flaws of a particular tool, why don't we try to choose what tool might work? And I know that requires vast knowledge of what's actually going on in country. But can you, gentlemen, with your military expertise, and I'm particularly proud of General Ham, because it is remarkable to ascend from private to full general. That's a rare accomplishment. What might work? Because the public back home really doesn't care about these places. They really do care about our troops. They want what's effective, but also what's affordable. You know, there are foreign powers sometimes involved in these regions. Our NATO allies are of varying trustworthiness. You know, this is a very complex problem to figure out, and it's easy to criticize. It's hard to perform. So what would be a better policy?
So, Mr. Cooper, I'll take a first attempt at that. First, I'd note for the record that I didn't go from private to four-star general in one step. There were a few years intervening there. So it took a bit of a while, but thank you for that acknowledgement. In my experience as a theater commander, as a service component commander, as the director for operations on the Joint Staff, I think there is a role for force management levels. It is in principle, I think force management levels serve a useful purpose in terms of conveying to military commanders and to military planners the intent of proper civilian authority, the Commander-in-Chief, the Secretary of Defense, making sure that the level of commitment of the United States Armed Forces are consistent with the intent of the civilian authority. So I think there is there's utility in force management levels. I think it is in the application where we have difficulty sometimes. It is, as the chairwoman commented, if you start the planning process with a force management level, I believe that leads you to a flawed planning process and will preclude military planners from offering civilian authorities the full range of capabilities and options that they ought to consider. So my preference would be to see force management levels applied after a full consideration of a wide variety of options, and when the appropriate civilian authority, Secretary of Defense, Commander-in-Chief, makes a decision, this is what we want to try to achieve, this is the level of effort that I think is about right, that, to me, is the time where force management levels ought be applied. And I would just finally note, Mr. Cooper, that I think you're right. Again, in application, what troops count, which don't. I don't believe it is the intent of force management levels to simply substitute uniformed U.S. military personnel for contractors or for temporary duty personnel and the like. So getting to the intent, I think, is the right start, and the appropriate application of force management levels at the appropriate time in the planning process, which to me is more toward the end of the planning process rather than at the beginning.
I can only echo that, Mr. Cooper. When the force management level decision is the product or the result of a extensive and thorough dialogue between the civil and military authorities, and that dialogue informs the final decision authority, whether Secretary of Defense or the President, of the range of options and risks, that's the time then to start talking about force management levels. If that process is aborted or an arbitrary force management level is set in lieu of having that kind of discussion, then the result is generally a level of force that is unlikely to succeed, just won't fail. And that's not a good position to be in.
Thank you, and I'll add on to that too. I totally agree with what the gentleman to my left said about the planning part of it. It's really important, you know, in terms of identifying what your risks are given a risk management level and knowing that. And sometimes I think, as we've heard anecdotally anyway, that if you provide a number early on, sometimes it almost serves as an appetite suppressant to folks that would submit requirements, and it may suppress the requirements coming in, so you may not have a full range of unconstrained requirements coming in to look at. So I think that part of risk assessment is right. Also, Mr. Cooper, what you pointed out I think is an important point as well, and as what the other gentleman said, was you know, as you look forward, I mean, troop caps and force management levels have been around a long time, and I think you got to look at them as a way of life that's likely they could continue in the future. So I think it's important that DoD look at ways to manage its forces in theater given those troop caps. What can be learned? And I think an important aspect of looking at these current operations where the troop caps are fairly low and limited is how do you manage a force to do that? In this case, in Iraq, for example, working more by, with, and through the Iraqis, how is that working? In some cases, you know, there's advantages because you do free up ground forces outside of the theater to do other things and maintain and develop readiness. You might have readiness enhancements with the partner forces that you're doing. But in the same sense, if you shift that burden over to other support functions such as air, special forces, that has other effects too. And I think it's up to DoD to kind of look at that whole mix and say, what's the optimal way to operate given a force structure? And I think right now we're really at an optimal point in time given the operations in Iraq and Syria, and particularly in Iraq, that taking stock at lessons learned and saying, how are we doing? What have we learned? What's worked well? What hasn't? And DoD could maybe develop that into a model for how they might be able to apply forces going forward in future deployments, should that be a continuation in the future.
Not to put too fine a point on it, but lest we be more critical than we are forward-focused, I would challenge the members of the subcommittee. If they don't like the current FML levels, and as Mr. Russell suggests, it's likely that FML approaches will be around for a long, long time, then what's your favorite number? If you don't like 10,000 or 5,000, pick one, and then justify it. Because it's too easy for us to say, oh, you know, whatever the Pentagon does is wrong. What's our approach? Because I think there's an ambivalence in the American public that is very hard to reconcile right now. And we feel that acutely in our districts because we want to win. But how do you win? And what does it take to win? And that's where the gap is. So if anyone has any specific suggestions, any particular numbers, because that's what policy boils down to. If you're not for this, what are you for? You can't just be against something.
Very good. Mr. Conway.
Well, following up on Mr. Cooper's comment, though, we're not in a position to know all of the answers as to what those levels ought to be without the full range of planning that needs to go on. So if force management levels or troop levels are the holy grail, not only during the planning phase but in the execution phase, what you see is workarounds. The DoD is really good at working around whatever it is. Now, they might not have been able to plan it properly on the front end because somebody put an arbitrary number out there, uninformed, like we would be doing, like you just suggested, and then clings to that number against everything else. That's as if that's the measure of what we need to be doing. It's just the number of people we got in the fight. I'd rather DoD have the flexibility of putting the range of what the fight needs to look like. Get it from the civilian folks. What do you want to accomplish? Here's how you do it. And then a policymaker has a better idea of what goes on and how to get it done. Then as the fight changes, which every fight does, then clinging to a number seems to me to be the wrong mechanic. Ought to be clinging to getting the job done. And so what you're seeing is TDY and contractors and everything else. I mean, the Department of Defense figures it out some way to get around whatever it is we've done. So I think it's the idea that policymakers cling to a number on the front end, uninformed, quite frankly, and you've seen that number change and move around. My question would be, TDY folks, do we have any sense, Mr. Russell, how many of those are involved, what the rotation cycles are, and where they're being pulled from and the impact it has, as well as the number has changed, particularly in Afghanistan, as the president got new information. Did the mechanics for that process work efficiently enough and nimble enough to make sure that the folks on the fight aren't trapped at a number that the workaround can't get to, and the mission is hurting as a result of lack of nimbleness and adjusting that number.
Yeah, thank you for that question. With regards to the number of TDY, we actually have some numbers, but unfortunately they're in a classified report, so I don't have them unclassified, but we have delivered a copy to the committee, and there's some information in there on troop levels, contractors, and TDY folks. But with regard to rotations, they're typically 90 to 120-day rotations, which creates some complications because one of the things is you lose that continuity. As people come in and come out, you sort of lose that learning curve and that continuity of folks that are working that problem in and out. Right.
In terms of General Ham and General Dublik, the process of changing, adjusting, how has the Department of Defense been able to get to the White House to get the number changed? Is that nimble enough?
Well, Mr. Conway, I suspect military commanders would always ask for greater flexibility, as you raised. But I think the point is that as conditions change, then there ought to be a mechanism by which force management levels can be reassessed and adjusted. For me, I think this is an appropriate role for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the most senior body of military advisors who have a global approach. As a former theater commander, you know, I kind of had my blinders on and my head down, and I was mostly concerned, almost exclusively concerned about what was going on in my particular area of responsibility. And so I would place operational demands, requirements for forces based on that. It is the Joint Staff who advising the Joint Chiefs of Staff that has this global view of things. And this is another role, I think, where force management levels can play an appropriate role in balancing and prioritizing the global effort of the U.S. Armed Forces. So I think a mechanism that allows the Joint Chiefs to consider various force management levels and then render their statutory best military advice to the Secretary and Commander-in-Chief, I think that process is a pretty good one. And I think that collective body of the most senior military advisors is in the best position to give best advice to the senior civilian authorities.
So, Mr. Connolly, I agree with General Ham's description of the process. My experience, at least in Iraq in 2007-8, was that the process is very slow, and that the pace of what happens in theater is much quicker than the pace of decision-making back here. And the result is often either having people with the wrong skill set or having insufficient numbers of people. Now, that could well have been fixed. It's been 7 years, and the numbers are a lot smaller, so they're easier to manage. But I have to report that my experience is that there's a disconnect in the speed of what happens in theater and the speed of decision-making and adjustment here.
Thanks, General. Appreciate it. You're back.
Representative Graham.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I have a lot of questions. Historically, you mentioned, I believe, Mr. Russell, that troop caps have been in place since the Vietnam War. Is that accurate?
Yes, ma'am.
What have we learned over time of the impact that troop caps have on our ability to fight the fight? I was recently on a CODEL with Chairman Conaway. Good to see you, Mike. And we were in Kuwait at the beginning of the Mosul, Liberation Mosul. And so that greatly affected me. And in terms of my question of, do troop caps, are they having, over time, historically, what have we learned as to the effect or challenges that troop caps place on our ability to be successful in operations like Mosul? Thank you.
Oh, yes, thanks for your question on that. Yeah, I think that's a good question. I'm not sure that anybody's captured lessons learned to that extent. I can tell you, though, now the environment, in my experience, is quite different. The troop caps in Vietnam were troop ceilings at a very high level. You can also look at where we were in terms of Afghanistan with 100,000 soldiers on the ground at one point, 170,000 in Iraq at one point. These are much larger. I think the real question now is we look at an environment where it's much, much smaller. And I think that's where, as you get smaller now, the trade-offs become much, much greater. So I think you're seeing a more of an impact and more of a challenge when you get down to that number. And I'm not sure yet. That's why I mentioned earlier, I think the lessons learned now are really critical, because it's in terms of what have we been able to accomplish and what cost and what risk in terms of getting the mission done, both in Iraq and now in Afghanistan, as the numbers come down even low. But I think we're kind of in a new area in terms of just the sheer number of constraint with regard to the levels where we're at now. It's kind of difficult to compare it back to those larger operations.
Do you, and this is, sorry, Madam Chairwoman, I'm going a little off topic, but I have not seen recently how we're doing in Mosul. Do you, anyone can give me a brief update? Anyone know?
At this point, I don't have the update, and of course, there's a lot of, be careful because a lot of the information is classified with
Right.
where it's going. I think, we're looking now in terms of our current work at enablers and how we're supporting them, and I think we'll have some work coming down the road. It'll probably be classified, but we will be looking into how enabling support is working to help the Iraqis. I think the important thing to know about Mosul is it's really an Iraqi-led operation. We really are working by, with, and through the Iraqis, probably more so than ever before. And so as we look to push through Mosul, I think it will be a real telling sign in terms of how well and how successful we are. I mean, as we say the proof is in the pudding, I think the pudding is Mosul, and we'll have to see how it goes.
I agree. We don't want to continue to be in this circle in Iraq. At some point, we have to figure out how to be successful and then get out. What is the role of, as we replace, based on troop caps, we replace with contractors? What, if we can just talk about Mosul, if you have enough information about that, what is the role in the offensive that contractors would be playing as opposed to troops, as we're under a limitation on the troops that we can bring into the offensive?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of difficult to answer, particularly at the classification level, and I don't have the on-the-ground knowledge of how Mosul's being conducted with regards to that. I can step back and say more generally, contractors play a wide role in a military operation, not just in specific military functions with regards to maintenance, as folks have talked about, but they do base security, they do construction, they do dining services, and so there's a great wealth of I guess, things that happen that contractors are responsible for. Sometimes it can be difficult to really isolate how much of that is because of a troop cap versus how much of that is just because overall the force doesn't provide those kinds of services. So it's kind of a challenging answer to really gauge how much contractors are supporting them. But I would just step back and say in any operation, particularly in the last several years, contractors have been an integral part of the fighting force, a lot of perspective.
And do we, yes, General?
Yes, ma'am. With respect to Mosul, there's a lot of open source information on Mosul, and I would commend you and your staff to read the updates from the Institute for the Study of War. They're sometimes daily and at least weekly. And the last update that I had read from those sources, again, all open source, non-classified, is that the pace of the operations in Mosul have slowed. That as the forces have, Iraqi forces moved into the city, from the outskirts and the small villages, that the pace of operations is much slower, both on the east and in the south. Further, that there's some concern about Iranian-sponsored militias operating west of Mosul and into Tel Afar. So the fight has gone, I think, at least from my experience, about how I expected. And I think we'll have many more months of fighting there. With respect to the train and advise mission, and your questions there, my opinion is to ask first, what's the objective? Is the objective merely to raise the tactical proficiency of the Iraqi security forces to a level to defeat ISIS in Mosul, and then pat ourselves on the back and said, we kicked them out of Ramadi, we kicked them out of Fallujah, we kicked them out of Mosul, now let's go home?
Yeah.
If that's the mission, we're about well-resourced. But under those conditions, we may be doing Battle of Fallujah 5.
Yeah.
So I think the troop cap is the easiest thing to talk about, but what the strategic aim is really the key question. Because if the troop cap is not based on a strategic mission that the country can buy into, it's going to be wrong regardless of whether it's high or low.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I appreciate your comments, and I yield back because I'm out of time. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you, Lee. Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Madam Chair. General Dubik, your comment, large enough not to fail, not large enough to succeed. I didn't get it exactly right. What do you remember what you said with that? I thought that was pretty.
That's pretty much it.
That's pretty much the way we're fighting our wars in a politically correct manner, isn't it? I mean, it's
Well, I wouldn't characterize it as politically correct, but
Fair
I would
enough.
characterize it as prolonging an already long war unnecessarily.
I never served. Certainly appreciate those who do, but my granddad was one of those World War II guys, and I can just imagine what he would be saying right now. I know he would ask me before we went into anything, have you made a decision to win it? Because if you haven't, then don't waste the lives that it's going to cost if you're not willing to do what it takes to win. And I want to get to the cost of this if I can, and just we know it costs us more than it costs to deploy our men and women that are in the military to fill most of those gaps with contractors. But if the DOD or the Secretary of State, if they can't tell us how much it's currently costing, then to me it seems that there's an extreme gap in oversight with regard to this. I mean, if they can't tell you, they can't tell us, they can't tell the Government Accountability Office, who knows what it's costing us?
I can only defer to Mr. Russell on the cost issue, because I've been out of the business now for detailed knowledge. But the cost, the fiscal cost of the war is an important element of waging this war. Mm-hmm. And again, the issue for me is the strategic aim. What are we trying to do? And is the cost in terms of dollars and lives worth that strategic aim? That's the key discussion. All money is wasted if we either have no strategic aim or have one that can't be attained or have the wrong one.
Mr. Russell, who has the information?
Various places in DOD, they certainly can track, I think, contract costs in aggregate. I think to get to your question, it becomes much more difficult, and that is we're trying to understand the incremental cost of what exact contractors are doing that might be related to working under an FML, for example. It just becomes very difficult, because then you have to be able to parse out which tasks, which contracts support them, and that's where you start losing that granularity. I mean, just from perspective in terms of contractors, right, there's a lot of money in contractors. Now, the information I have is somewhat dated, but going back to Afghanistan, in fiscal year 2011, when we had a height of operations, we were spending $16 billion on contracts. I mean, if you look back at the Commission for Wartime Contracting, between 2002 and 2011, we were spending about $166 billion in Iraq and Afghanistan on contracting. So you're absolutely right. It's a very large dollar that's being spent. I think where you start to lose that granularity is when you start going down to exactly what are they doing, what are they working on, and which missions are they supporting becomes a lot more difficult.
General Ham, you've served at probably more levels than anybody else in the military. Thank you for your service. What impact does it have on the readiness of our units when you deploy part of a unit and not the rest of the unit? Aviation brigades is something that I'm thinking of. And what do you think the impact on morale is?
Oh, Mr. Scott, I think it's a great question. There are, I think, some identifiable readiness impacts in terms of when you split a unit that is not intended, not designed to be severable, when you split it apart, whether it's an aviation unit, as we've discussed, separating maintenance from the flying crews, whether it's, as the chairwoman identified, whether it's an advise and assist brigade that most of the young soldiers stay at home and most of the non-commissioned officers and officers deploy. So you have time and expense to reform that unit upon redeployment, because they are no longer a cohesive unit. So it'll take additional money, additional ammunition, additional time to rebuild readiness. But I think the point that you hit upon in terms of morale, esprit, I think those are somewhat intangibles, but have a very real effect on readiness. If in the same unit you have soldiers who are deployed and those who aren't, you have a little bit of haves and have-nots. There are, obviously, as the Congress has approved, there There are financial advantages to service members who are deployed that those who aren't deployed don't enjoy. There are different family hardships, those who are deployed, those who are not deployed. I think those have a yet-to-be-determined effect on unit morale and long-term what the effects may be on retention of some very highly qualified individuals in our service. So I think it's a great question. I don't know that those answers are readily available.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative McSally.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony. And Mr. Cooper, I do want to follow up on you said provide an alternative to just random numbers. It would be to set strategic objectives in these theaters, identify what we're trying to do, and then figure out what we need to get the mission done, and then that ends up being the number. I mean, this is, to have a number be the driver or causing all the things that are in the discussion and the testimony today. I led a CODEL back to Afghanistan, been there myself in uniform, of course, but last in May, and deep concern seeing what we're talking about here firsthand, with also commanders and others spending a tremendous amount of time to find workarounds and measure the jerry-rigging in order to comply. So these real concerns are there, and they're taking the time of the commanders to not do the mission, but to actually comply with these random numbers. I think the first question I would have is, what is the purpose of the caps? What's the purpose of the numbers, the limits on boots on the ground? Is it cost? Is it risk to Americans? Because in these cases, the cost we're seeing is probably higher, as was discussed already today. A risk to an American contractor is similar to a risk to an American troop. So it's not even clear what is the objective of these particular force management limits right now in Afghanistan and Iraq, because it seems like we're not achieving either of them, if it's risk or if it's cost. And I think about, I remember back when I was at Bagram with my A-10 squadron on Christmas Eve, out on the flight line with my maintenance troops, trying to get an engine fix that had been problematic and had an emergency. On Christmas night, in the middle of the cold and the snow, trying to get this done, and everybody doing everything they can to keep the mission going around the clock. Those were my maintenance guys that reported to me. And one thing with the contractors is they don't report to the commander. They report to some program manager. And if you want to have to get them to do something differently, you can't direct them to do that. So what hasn't, first of all, the question is about what do you think the purpose is of the caps? Because I think we're not achieving any of the purposes, potentially. And then secondly, what's the impact on unity of command, chain of command? Because if you got contractors out there, it's just a different relationship than if they're your unit. General Ham first.
No, I'll take a first attempt at that, if I may. I think there are valid purposes for force management levels. I think it does ensure that the application of U.S. Armed Forces is consistent with the policy decisions that are made by the Commander-in-Chief, by the Secretary of Defense, and within the resource constraints that have been approved by the Congress. So I think there are there's an appropriate role for force management levels. From a purely military standpoint, I think it is one way to manage the global force and the requirements that the Department of Defense needs to meet around the globe. It does have a tendency, it does constrain unanticipated growth, so-called mission creep, from occurring without appropriate approval and authority. So I think there is a proper role for that. But I think you're exactly right, ma'am, to say when activities are driven by a number rather than by the mission,
right,
then I think we have got things out of whack and out of priority. So again, back to my earlier statement, I think it is when is the force management level decided upon in the planning and decision-making process, and what's the appropriate mechanism for revisiting that as conditions change.
Right. And then comments on the chain of command, or General Dubik, do you want to talk about that?
I'll first reiterate that I've been under force management levels 3 times, first in Haiti, second in Bosnia, third in Iraq. And at each of those times, in my opinion, the force management levels were set correctly by the strategic objective, not as high as the military commanders wanted, but not as low as they are now. So there is a role for these things. In terms of contractors, I have to report that I've only had good experiences with those contractors that had worked for me in.
Oh, they're great people, don't get me wrong. I mean, I've worked
And-
alongside tremendous contractors as
And
well.
in terms of responsiveness, I've had bad experiences, though, with respect to flexibility. Because when you change the task, you have to change the contract. And that is a very timely affair. For example, we had to change the contract for police development in Iraq in 2008. Took 8 months. I initiated it. I left. My successor inherited. And in that intervening 8 months, we had the mismatch of skill sets and personnel to do the job that was required.
Got it. Just final comment on the TDY element. When I was there in the spring, we had entire units TDY to Helmand Province to help stop the bleeding there. You don't go TDY to Helmand Province. You go TDY to Nellis Air Force Base. To be calling TDY to a combat zone, to be out there addressing the combat situation is ridiculous, and that's what these random force management levels have created. That's just insane. And I would just say, I know I'm out of my time, Mr. Russell. If there is any study of the exact costs, I'd ask that it would consider also the cost of stationing air assets outside Iraq and Afghanistan, like combat search and rescue, ISR, tactical airlift, that are now in the theater but further away. Both the financial costs with fuel and the other assets, and then the risks. If you don't have Seesaw right there, you're talking about risk to lives because you're not as responsive. And these things need to be included in any discussion as well. Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it.
You bet. Mr. Russell, will there be a study on that?
At this point, we're not looking at it. We can look into it. We do have a study going on where we're looking at enabling support that's being provided. So potentially, potentially as we look at that, we could get into some of those issues as well in terms of what enabling support is being provided. But we'll have to look at that and see.
Yeah, I would encourage you to do that and to get back with us on that, because I think Representative McSally brings up a really good point. It'd be great to have you look into that. So.
Yes, ma'am.
Representative Walorski.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thank you, gentlemen, for your service to our country. Very much appreciate it. Just as a follow-up, I mean, there's been a lot of the same kind of questions going down the same trails here, but are there areas now that are critical to the ANSF's future viability and success that we can't effectively impact due to the low troop cap? But I want to just do a follow-up in that really quickly. For example, are soldiers unable to advise certain units who may need it simply because we don't have the boots on the ground necessary to adequately secure the training area? And I want to wrap this third question into this. To follow up on that, in a more quantity versus quality question, if General Nicholson were to see progress in one area, like basic soldiering, but not in another, like vehicle maintenance or command and control, does he have the flexibility to alter the composition of the troops on the ground? Or is that the kind of flexibility, General Ham, that you were speaking of, that there just needs to be more flexibility?
Ma'am, I'm sorry, I'm not sufficiently current with to answer your questions about the ANSF. I think you're absolutely valid questions, to be sure. On the last point,
Sure.
My sense is that the theater commander has the ability to determine the requirements within the troop cap. I mean, he can request certain capabilities. So if he needs more maintenance and less infantry, I think he has the ability to make there is a process through which he makes those changes in the requirements, so long as they stay within the force management level. I think it's much more difficult for him to make a recommend. The process, as we have discussed, to change the force management level is a much more cumbersome, much more time-consuming process.
General Dubik.
Yes, ma'am. With respect to ANSF, my guess is that the allocation of forces there is insufficient. And I based it on a general knowledge of the task. This is what I had done in Iraq, and I've been to Afghanistan about 4 times looking at the ANSF and overall mission. When you're trying to build a self-sufficient army, there are 4 pieces of that army that you have to look at. The first is, I'll say, the tip of the spear. That's the tactical proficiency. The second is the layers or echelons of command that support the tip of the spear. The third part are the senior military commands that generate the resources, people, things, and money to flow down through the chain of command, and the last is the Ministry of Defense, which of course has the mission to acquire people, acquire things, determine the size of the force, make policy decisions. All four of those are necessary for a self-sufficient Army. And my belief is that the current numbers are insufficient to adequately address all four pieces simultaneously. So what General Nicholson has to do is a matter of priorities, where he wants to shift closer to the tip, closer to the, and that's part of his job.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Chair. Yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Russell.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you for calling this panel here today. I had the honor to serve with General Ham on several assignments, and his thumbprint is pretty deep in my life with his influence. And General Dubik's reputation is second to none also. Thank you for being here. I think, Mr. Cooper, you ask an important question that we rarely ask, and it's been articulated here by several of us. What will work? And I want to echo, establish the purpose of what it is that we want to do, and then the tasks that would accomplish that purpose, and then put troops to the task. It really is that simple. Military leaders do that all the time, and yet oftentimes what happens is that after those requests are made, we have to have the political will as politicians, as much as I hate that word, being a warrior most of my life. We have to have the political will to back up the recommendations, and at that point, support it rather than equivocate, and we need to avoid accusations when we force them into a cap area that wasn't adequate to accomplish the task by saying, well, it's mission creep, and you keep coming back and asking for more. It probably wasn't adequate to begin with. Civilian authority often fails to recognize that the most humane thing you can do in battle is to end the carnage and suffering as quickly as possible. That is rarely achieved with half-hearted or restrained commitment. I guess my question, General Ham, sir, to you would be, would you say that military capacity that is translated to contractors increases efficiency and saves money, or reduces it and causes more money to correct lack of continuity and cohesion on both ends of active operations and redeployment?
Well, thanks, sir. It's great to see you again, and I guess I would make the argument that your imprint is perhaps deeper on me than mine on yours, but thanks for that. Thanks for continuing to serve. I think the issue of contractors is one that deserves lots of study. Mr. Russell and others have looked at this, and I think appropriately so. There is, in my view, an absolutely appropriate role for contractors in combat theaters. There are a number of functions that they can perform, often at less cost than uniformed personnel, but not all tasks. I think where we, in my view, where we get it wrong is when, whether because of force management levels or other factors, we seek contractors to perform inherently military tasks. If the military doesn't, if we don't have sufficient capacity, if that capability is applied somewhere else in the world and it certainly isn't, and just isn't available, then to me it makes sense perhaps to turn to a contracting option. But in the example that we have cited a number of times this morning for aviation maintenance as one example, aviation units, as you know very well, are built with organic maintenance capability to not employ that, but employ contractors in lieu of that uniformed capability seems to be not only fiscally a bad choice, but operationally a bad choice as well. But I certainly would not, discount the important role that contractors perform in a wide variety of functions.
Well, and I appreciate the distinction of contractors having a role on tasks that are not inherently military. I would totally agree with that. I think where we have made errors since the peace dividend days, where we've reduced everything, and put so much shift to contractors is that we have forced them into a lot of military roles, complicating things such as civilians on the battlefield, the laws of land warfare, and many other aspects that we fail to recognize. General Dubik, I guess in a follow-on on this, sir, would be if contractors cannot support certain combat operations due to the limitations of their contracts, and I know you face this in some unique environments from disaster support to failed government to also combat operations, what impacts does contractors' lack or limitation in those roles have on the ability to swiftly accomplish the tasks as a commander?
Well, thank you, sir. I actually have just a slightly different perspective, and that is that contractors can perform the task that they're contracted to do actually pretty well. But there's zero flexibility to the commander beyond that. With a soldier who is a cook or a mechanic or a clerk, and you need an additional force protection people, there they are. You need additional convoy security people, there they are. So a soldier deployed is much more flexible than a contractor deployed.
He's probably cheaper, I'm guessing?
I would say at least as expensive, if not way cheaper.
Thank you, sir. And thank you, Madam Chairman, for allowing me to join today.
Great questions. I have a few more questions I'd like to ask and welcome the ranking member here. And I know she has some questions, so we'll turn to her in just a minute. But I wanted to go back to the maintainers issue and how they're splitting those out of the units. Is there any rational reason where you would split those in developing the number, the troop levels? Do you think that was considered?
Madam Chairman, I think it goes back to the point that General Dubik has raised. It starts with what is the purpose that you want to achieve, and if in the analysis of that purpose and then an articulation of a mission, if you come to the conclusion that the right application of force is perhaps not all of a unit, so take an aviation brigade, maybe you don't need the entirety of the aviation brigade, that you would only deploy part of it, then I think there would be some rationale for deploying part of the unit, leaving part at home. But to me, that would be you would deploy airframes, air crews, maintenance, and ground support in proportion to the mission, and those that would stay at home station would also retain the capabilities of maintenance, ground support, and the like. So, again, these units that are not designed to be severable, we have to be very careful when we do in fact separate them, particularly if the purpose is to meet a number rather than to meet a mission.
So you would assume that the 8,448 number that they came up with has caused the maintainers to stay home. There's no rational reason for them in their planning to send an entire unit over there and leave the maintainers at home.
Madam Chairwoman, it's my understanding that in those cases where those decisions were made, they were made primarily as a consequence of the force management level.
Very good. Okay, thank you. Mr. Russell, how does the U.S. government oversee contractors in the theater? So say the maintainers.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, because for the last several years, we've looked at oversight issues and oversight challenges. And typically when you're in theater, you have contractors, officers, representatives that would be assigned, and typically these are military personnel that get this as a secondary duty. And they would be responsible for making sure that the contractor does what's supposed to be done under the contracts that they're required to do. They're basically the eyes and ears of the contracting officer. And even when we look at the heyday when there was 100,000 troops on the ground in Afghanistan, we found challenges where contracting officer representatives had too many contracts and they weren't able to get out and actually observe the performance of the contracts, leading to all sorts of undesirable effects, such as in one case a 5-compound building was built, for example, outside the wire of a base. The contracting officer just couldn't simply get out there and do the job they had to do. And so while adjustments have been made and DOD has made some progress, it does raise big questions when you have a smaller troop round. Can you be able to absorb that oversight capacity in addition to all the other missions that you're trying to accomplish under the same cap?
Good point. I want to follow up on the TDY questions. Do TDY forces cost more than other deployed forces?
I'm not sure if I have the information to be able to answer that question. I think one of to get to the point though about TDY, one concern I would like to bring up is the fact that when you do the TDY, sometimes you lose visibility over the total force that's actually doing the mission. And I think that's some of the risk that you face with the TDYs. Are we capturing and tracking and matching that up to the folks that are on the ground to ensure that that's the real requirement and that's what it takes to get the job done?
So has the use of temporary personnel strained in any way medical or logistical support forces?
I have not looked at that, so I wouldn't be in a position yet to be able to say that. Some of the ongoing work may get into it. Of course, that would be at a classified level. We've talked about that in that kind of venue.
If I may, Madam Chairwoman, I think, again, it goes back to purpose. If we're making a decision to send people into an operational theater on in a temporary duty status as a means of circumventing the force management level, and I think that probably ought to be questioned. There are certainly legitimate purposes for people to go into an operational theater on temporary duty. For example, perhaps fielding a new piece of equipment might, a short duration, specific purpose. Temporary duty might be exactly the right status for those individuals. But if it's just intended to keep them below the force management level, that probably is circumventing the intent.
Very good. Jim Dubig? All right, very good. Ranking Member Spear.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for participating today. I apologize for not being here at the beginning, but we have organizational hearings going on and other committee hearings that I had to participate in. But I'm here now, and I thank you. I'd like to just clarify the term FML. It's my understanding that force management levels are not set in stone. This is a question for you, General Ham. And that the administration has been relatively flexible about this. What flexibilities for adjustments are there?
Well, ma'am, thanks. It's good to see you again. I think that once a force management level is decided upon by appropriate civilian authority, there ought to be sufficient flexibility to adjust that based on changing conditions on the ground. And I think in my experience, that system is pretty cumbersome. And from a military standpoint, it's been more difficult, I think, to adjust the force management level. So that's why I think we have seen military commanders make some decisions to keep the troop level underneath the force management level, use of contractors, some of the issues that Mr. Russell articulated in terms of special operations forces and the like.
So what you're suggesting then is that the FML is too inflexible and you don't have the opportunity to increase it by 3%, 2%, 10%.
As a former military commander, I would argue for greater flexibility and agility for the appropriate civilian authority to adjust force management levels based on changed conditions and recommendations of the theater commander and of the Joint Chiefs in their role as managing the global force.
Which is a really important point, because in the end, it's a game that's being played, right? In terms of numbers. If you have the FML, you can't exceed it, then you're going to hire more the contractors to do what you need to do, sounds like. Is that right?
Well, I think, ma'am, we certainly have seen some examples of that, and I do believe that there is an appropriate role for force management levels, but I think we have seen in implementation what I think some
adverse consequences.
Yeah,
all right.
Ways to get around it.
To what extent is the FML determined in conjunction with another sovereign nation?
It's an important consideration. Certainly, in most of the places where U.S. Armed Forces are deployed, there is a sovereign government. Not always, but But when there is a sovereign government, certainly that's a very, very important consideration. And I think that certainly has been the case, and I think that has been one of the reasons why, one of the determinants of what the force management level is. I think that's appropriate, that the host nation would have some say in that, but it's also got to be a communication between the U.S. government and that host nation government in terms of what is achievable at various levels of forces.
Well, in the end, unless we do it in conjunction with the host country, we're in occupation mode, correct?
Yes, I think certainly we respect the sovereignty of these nations, and it is important to do this in conjunction with them.
So my understanding is that Iraq has been fairly clear that they want us in advisory roles and a limited FML. Is that correct?
That's my understanding. Yes, ma'am.
All right. And in terms of the whole issue of readiness, and I think there probably is a difference of opinion on the committee in terms of how many more troops we want to have in engagement in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that's one question. But then the other question is really one about readiness and whether or not we want them there or ready to engage in other conflicts. So let me ask you this question, and you might have to take it down to make sure you get your answer right. I'm going to ask all three of you this question. If you had a choice, if you could spend more money, would you, A, give it to our troops in terms of more time at home to rest, train, and recuperate between deployments? B, increase the number of troops we have in Afghanistan? C, increase the number of troops we have fighting ISIS in Iraq and Syria? Or D, forward deploy to increase deterrence in Europe? So, Mr. Russell, what would be your answer?
Well, I wouldn't want to speak on behalf of the administration in terms of what the best course of action to be. I think you'd have to go back to looking at what are the objectives and have we really defined what it is we're trying to accomplish. I think as you mentioned, just as a precursor, when you look at FMLs, you do have advantages and disadvantages that go with it that have to be, the trade-offs have to be compared. I mean, as you mentioned, one of the things, to the extent that you have a smaller force cap, obviously the more troops you're going to have available to do other things. And so I think having the objective and the force cap lined up right has to be looked at globally across the board. So I think those are some of the significant considerations that have to be made in order to make those choices.
So you're not going to answer my question?
It's a little difficult for me to pick one from where I sit.
All right, General Ham, would you?
Yeah, I think I'll find myself probably in the same case as Mr. Russell in terms of not giving you a precise answer.
You realize that.
But this is the question you raised, ma'am, is exactly the right question, because there are finite resources. And so this is the balancing between operational requirements in theaters across the globe, balancing that with readiness for future contingencies, some of which are unforeseen, so we have to have some capability to meet that. Certainly, the preservation of the all-volunteer force, I think, is a very, very high priority, and that means you've got to afford a quality of life for people that they're not constantly deployed. So that is a balance. The one I would answer specifically, and I will fall back on my time on the National Commission on the Future of the Army. I do believe there is a requirement for an increase in forward deployed forces in Europe.
So you would answer D.
I would answer D. I think for the increase in forward deployed.
Okay. I would concur. Thank you, General Dubé.
Yes, ma'am. So I'm looking at readiness in two senses: readiness for current operations and readiness for the unforeseen contingencies. With respect to the first, I would answer D also, but I would do so not in a rotation basis, but a PCS basis, because then you can accomplish both A and D at the same time. But the other part of the question, readiness for contingency operations, is one that's equally important. For example, right now we have 5 brigade combat teams doing training and assist kind of things. Well, that means you have 5 doing it, 5 preparing to do it, and 5 recovering. That's 15 brigade combat teams allocated to that task. And as soon as they deploy with all of their leaders but not their soldiers, you have 5 brigades instantly unready for contingency operations. And when they return, you have 5 brigades that are unready for 1 to 3 years, 1 to 2 years in terms of preparation. So I would answer the second part for contingency operations, actually E, we have not allocated, I think, a sufficient number of total end strength to the armed forces to serve the global requirements of the United States. And part of the contractor issue, part of the force management issue is a mask to that requirement that is not being met. And we're taking significant risk focusing on near-term readiness for current operations, which is absolutely required. But the risk is being unable to respond to a contingency operation. And as Secretary Gates has famously said, you know, we are always 100% wrong and 100% surprised. And we have placed the armed services in a very risky situation if anything happens other than current operations.
Ma'am, could I add one more?
Of course.
So the other place I think would be helpful would be increased flexibility, authority, and resourcing for the reserve components of the U.S. Armed Forces so that they can be more operationally employed, certainly on a predictable basis and certainly not as frequently as the regular forces, but there's great capacity, great skill, great experience in the reserve components. We want to keep them ready as well.
All right. Thank you all. I yield back.
Great questions. Well, I think we've had very good discussion today. It's been very helpful to look at where we are now. What are some of the issues that we're facing with the troop levels, caps that have been set into place, and as we look to move forward, you know, what needs to be done. And so I appreciate your expertise. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your continued service to our country, and this hearing stands adjourned.